React Native setting up. React Native projects depend on a tool called Expo and its command line interface, CLI. The first step, which we only need to do once for all future projects, is to install this tool, Expo-CLI, globally-G using npm. So the first command we're going to run is npm install expo-cli space -g. The -g is globally, and of course we are installing a tool, Expo CLI, the command line interface for Expo. I'm going to pause right here, move over to Visual Studio Code and start this process, which will take a little bit of time, and then we can come back and talk about future slides. So let me move over to Visual Studio Code. And we'll see over here, I have a project open, mobile development, which is the default folder I've been using for these videos, as well as I have a terminal open, PowerShell within Windows, and I currently have the command npm install expo-cli space -g already typed out. I'm going to go ahead and press enter. So just like we do any other normal installation using npm, it's going to go ahead and look to the servers, find out the exact things it needs to install, and then go through that process for us. However, it can take a considerable amount of time depending on other factors like downloading and package sizes and other things. So we're going to go ahead and start this process here. We'll move back to the slides, and then we'll come back to this once it's finished. So let's move back to the slides then. So we started this. This is the very first thing we need to do. And so we've already got that running. But now that we have it running, again, we need to do it once. Once it's done, we will have this tool installed globally and we can use it for all future projects. And it will, especially in future videos, come back and I'll talk about how Expo plays a role in all of this. But this is the first step we need to take. So after that is finished, and again, we'll go through these and go back to Visual Studio Code afterwards. But after we have that installed, because we will need it later, we're going to follow something we've also done for React. So for React Native projects, we're going to be running the command npx space create-react-native-app, and then put the folder after it. Notice this looks very, very similar to using React, where we did create-react-app. Now we're adding the word native as part of that hyphenation. So this will follow the same steps we did for React, now for React Native. However, there's an additional step we need to put into this. So unlike React, where we just ran this command, create React app, and then the folder name, we need to choose new app when given the option for React Native. The reason why we do this is part of the process for create-react-native app is that we can also create templates based on combinations of working with other tools. Right now, we don't want to necessarily mess with those tools, but we will build to those later. We want to start though with the default new app, so we need to select default new app. Given the option, we press enter, it creates the default project for us. And again, we'll talk about those templates in a later video. So this gets it started. First thing we do is install the Expo CLI tool globally. Very first thing we'll do. Next thing we'll do is this, and as soon as that process is finished over in Visual Studio Code, we'll move back and I'll run this command and then we'll talk about it. And then finally, there's one last step we need in setting up. We're going to be using the experimental web builder. So as part of React Native projects, they are designed to run on native mobile devices. That is, using the Expo app, which I'll talk about in a later video, we will pull up these builds and run them on actual mobile devices, which I'll also show as part of this recording process. I'll show you a mobile device I have set up to this computer so we can look at the screen on the mobile device and look at our development at the same time. But to help us just generally get going on this, we're going to be using the experimental web builder, as I mentioned, which we start using npm run web. Again, as a review of npm scripts, it will look in the package.json file under the scripts object, look for an entry named web, and then run that command. For us, this will internally run two separate processes. And we will see this, like when we're using with React, this will open two separate tabs, and it takes a little bit of a second to move from one to the other, so we always need to be a little bit patient. The first one, and the one we're actually going to use a lot more moving forward, is called something called the Metro Bundler, which I'll talk about later in a future video. But that will open the first tab and it will start that, which will be using with mobile devices in the future. And the second one is the building for web using Webpack and some other processes, which again, I'll talk about more in a future video. But for right now, what we know is we will run the installation to set up Expo CLI. Then we create our project using whatever folder name we want. Then, just for testing purposes, we'll run the web experimental build so we can actually see it in a web browser without moving over to a mobile device just for the setup. So now that I've said all that, let's move back to Visual Studio Code and see if it's finished. Which it probably has by this point. Yes, it has. Okay, so added 27 packages from 30 contributors, removed to updated 36, and 237 seconds. So it would have taken a few minutes to do that. So okay, now that I've got Expo CLI loaded, again, we only need to do it once and we're good for a really long time. So first step, like I said, get that done. Next step, I want to create a React Native project. I'm going to do that through npx npx space create -react -native -app space, and for this video I'm going to call this example all lowercase, and I'm going to press enter. So just like we used create React app, this will create a React Native app. So notice here it gives me an option. It said, okay, do you want a default new app or do you want to use a template from the examples? I'm going to highly recommend for just right now to always choose default new app unless you know what you're doing, or in a future video I talk about using one of these other examples that again work with other tools. So we're going to start with default new app. I'm going to go ahead and press enter. And it's going to set this up for us. Now this could also take a considerable amount of time. So notice the previous thing took 237 seconds, so that's a little bit of time. While this is going, let's go back and review all of these steps. So again, once this gets going, we'll be good, but it can take, again, a few minutes to get going. So let's jump back over to the slides and just review everything I've talked about. So coming back over here then, we see that the first thing we want to do, and I will move back to the beginning slide here. First thing we always want to do, and again, we only need to do it once, and it's good for all future projects, is go ahead and install that Expo -CLI. So the command line interface for the Expo, and again, we'll talk about this more in a future video because we will be using this tool quite frequently with React Native projects. But we only need to install it once, we install it globally, and it's good to go for a long time. Next thing we need to do, which is currently working in the background in Visual Studio Code, is to create that React Native app, again using the create -react -native -app in the name of the folder. And again, npx, just like we did for React projects. And unlike React though, we need to make sure we do that default new app choice at the very beginning. It will set it all up for us. So finally, once that's finished, and I'll show that once everything's done, we will finally go ahead and use the experimental web builder using npm run web. Again, this is experimental, as I've mentioned a couple of times now, which means it won't always work for everything we want to do, but for fairly simple things, and especially just getting started, it is really useful and also helps us without needing to pull up a mobile app or pull up a mobile device and a mobile app and working with other things. We can run it in the web and just open it within our web browsers. This is incredibly useful for initial testing, but again, it won't work with everything. And in fact, as we get into more advanced projects across future videos, we won't actually be able to use it anymore. But again, for starting out, very, very useful. And it means we don't have to set anything else up. So let's go ahead and check out Visual Studio Code while I've been talking about this and see where it's at. So moving over here then, we see it's still doing this, and it's probably going to be doing this for quite a bit. So we will sit and wait a little bit and wait for it to finish. Okay, so it's finally finished, and the last command we need to run then is this npm run web. And notice actually in Visual Studio Code it showed us that, so let's jump back and look at that. So it finally finished, and it took a few minutes. So again, when you're doing this, you give it a little bit of patience, let it go. Okay, so now in mobile development, which is a folder I have open, I now have a new folder called example. So notice right here it says change directory example. So that's the next thing I'm going to do. And now I'm looking at example folder. Now it gives us some options here. It says, hey, you can run Android if you have that set up, which it doesn't say here, but that's something to remember. Run iOS, but you must be running on a Mac OS device. As it says right here, you must use Mac OS. iOS will not run on Windows. See, it says use the Expo app if you need to do iOS development without a Mac. And then finally, npm run web. So let's go ahead and do that, and then we'll wrap this all up. So npm run web then, and I will just set that up right here. And move back to Visual Studio Code and do npm run web. So again, this will start up two different main processes we're going to pay attention to. Notice right here it says Expo start. We'll come back to that in a future video. It's going to start up two different processes we care about. The first one is something called the Metro Bundler, which I mentioned before. And this is what we're going to use when we test on actual mobile devices. Second thing it's going to do is a process using Webpack and some other tools, and it's going to open it in a secondary tab. So I'm going to show these two tabs here as soon as everything's finished. But again, the first one will be the Metro Bundler, which we will use and talk more about in future videos. And the second one will be, there it goes, the Webpack and developer mode. So let's give everything just a second to load, and then we will be ready. So again, even though this takes a little bit of time to set up, it will react, pun intended, more quickly, just like we used for React. So the good news is once we have this all set up, which again takes a little bit of time, I know it's a little frustrating sometimes to get going. But again, like the Expo CLI tool, once we have it installed, we're good to go. Once we have our project set up, when we do things like this, like we're using React and it did live reloading, it will also live reload with the Metro Bundler, which again, I'll talk about more in a future video, and especially with the web build, which will also update in near real time as it also handles that same live reloading we used in React. So I will prepare these in just a second, and then we'll move over to them. But again, we test, and we're going to be testing using that setup, and I'm just waiting for Firefox to reload here, and then we'll be ready to go. So the first thing you're going to see is the Metro Bundler, which I'll pull up here. So Expo Development Tools using the Metro Bundler, and we'll give it just a second to load. So right here says Metro Bundler info is loaded. So the next thing I'm going to show then is, and I will show that here in a separate tab. Oops, come on. There we go. There we go. So now we're looking at this, which should look incredibly familiar. It's the same thing we saw in React. So we're now running React Native, which uses two tabs. First one being Metro Bundler, which again, I'll talk about more in a future video. But the other thing I want to particularly note is notice this little QR code down here. We're going to come back to that. But right now we're also using web, which is this right here. So let's move back to Visual Studio Code one last time. And I'm going to go ahead and open this folder right here. I'm going to talk much more about this in the future video, but I'm just going to scroll down here to app.js. And just point out this right here. It's the same general text we saw for a React project. We're now seeing React Native. So the tools, the skills we learned for React move over into React Native. It's a little bit more complicated with some slight tool variation. Again, we're running some extra processes here, but still the same setup, the same concepts, and especially the same skill progression in React, thinking about components, moves over from React into React Native and helps us bridge that gap into now what is a different tool set, same general concepts. So then to finally wrap up this video, I just want to mention the 3 things I've reviewed here. So very first thing you will always have to do is install that Expo CLI tool. Globally, you just need to do it once and you're good to go for all future projects. Next thing is we create React Native apps using that npx create-react-native-app and then the name of the folder. Then we choose default project for now. And then once all of that's done, we can do a quick test of running npm run web, and that will show us, again, using 2 different tabs. First one is the Metro bundler, which again I'll talk about more later, and the second one is the web page that we just saw previously. So just like React, and now in React Native, notice on here it says press Ctrl-C to exit. I'm going to go ahead and do that. It will close both things down. Notice closed Webpack server, closing Expo server, stopping Metro bundler, and now we're back where we started. So now that this is all set up, in future videos I'll talk more about React Native, but again, we got to take that little bit of extra time to set up that initial tool, then set up our initial default project. But once it's going again, we will be able to use that live reloading and things will move much faster. Just that little bit of extra time at the setup at the beginning. Thanks for watching.